Good afternoon. We're going to wait a few minutes just to allow people to join in. It's just 12 noon on the spot right now, so please stay tuned. I'm watching the participant number go up. We're at 60, 62. I'll wait just a few more seconds. Thank you all for being here on time. Okay, let's get started. Um, Again, good afternoon. I'm Dina Hurwitz, and we are thrilled to be presenting a national human rights institution for the US. Why don't we have one? This panel is sponsored by the ABA section of Civil Rights and Social Justice and co-sponsored by the ABA's International Law section. And we're actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on these programs. During today's program, please, we encourage you to ask questions of our panelists through the Q&A, not the chat function. If you do not see the controls, perhaps you should ensure that your screen is not idle, refresh it. I will be monitoring the Q&A and we'll do our best to address your questions, time permitting. We'll also be sharing a recording of this program with everyone who is registered so that you can share it more widely with your networks. So for our panel, we are fortunate to have three of the most resourceful and persistent human rights lawyers in the country who are working on the establishment of a national human rights institution. Before introducing them, I want to thank two people, Dan Appelman, who is the chair of CRSJ's International Human Rights Committee, and the indomitable Hadar Harris, who is the founder and principal of Rights and Justice Consulting, for suggesting this program and helping to organize it. Our speakers are Jamil Dakwar, who's the director of the Human Rights Program at the ACLU. He heads the ACLU's international advocacy before regional and international bodies, including serving as the ACLU's main representative to the UN. And he co-coordinated civil society organizations participating in the UN Human Rights Committee's periodic review of the US under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights this past November. We have Martha Davis, who is the University Distinguished Professor of Law and the co-director of the Program on Human Rights and the Global Economy at Northeastern University School of Law. She is co-author of Human Rights Advocacy in the United States, which is the first law school textbook that focuses on domestic human rights, now in its third edition. And Professor Davis, along with Fergie Fellows and the Bringing Human Rights Home Network, coordinated the compilation of civil society shadow reports to the Human Rights Committee that I just mentioned. And David Kay, who is the clinical professor of law and the director of the International Justice Clinic at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. He's currently a Fulbright Distinguished Scholar at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights at Lund University in Sweden. He's a former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and his clinic has been at the forefront of the advocacy for National Human Rights Institute and produced a report a year ago on establishing a National Human Rights Institution in the US, which was based on interviews with NHRI experts and practitioners worldwide and two workshops that their clinic hosted in 2022. So the presentation, the order of our webinar is like this. We'll start by hearing from our three experts in the following order. David Kay will give us an overview of the issues. What's NHRI? What do they do? Why do we need one? Jamil Dakwar will ground all of this in current initiatives to encourage US government to move forward with the NHRI. And Martha Davis will bring us up to date with moving forward, implementation, how we can apply these ideas and recommendations in a concrete way. And each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion to take your questions and comments. And remember, please enter your questions through the Q&A link, not the chat function. Thank you for joining us, and let's begin, shall we?
Great.
Thank you.
I guess that's my cue. Dina, thank you so much. Thank you to the ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section, to you, Dina, to Dan, to Hadar Harris in particular, for doing so much work over the last several months on this issue and for helping sort of urge us to make this happen. And special thanks to my co-panelists. There are few people in the United States who have done as much, perhaps nobody, maybe with Dina and Hadar's exception, who've done as much to push for human rights at home as Jamil and Martha, and I'm really just honored to be on a panel with them. So in my remarks, I want to do a few things. First, I want to situate this movement, if I can call it that, for an American national human rights institution in the US legal and political context. Second, I want to explain the idea itself. That is, what is an NHRI, or what are NHRIs, and what can they offer the United States? And then third, and finally, in a kind of bridge to Jamil's remarks, I'll just note and highlight our main request at this particular moment. So let me begin with sort of situating what we're doing in the US context. And some of this will be no news to the many of you who have joined this webinar, and I want to thank you also for joining this webinar. The United States is a founding member of the international human rights movement, a founding member of the United Nations, whose charter centers human rights in its work. And the United States has been a central player in human rights law's development for nearly 80 years. Of course, there's Eleanor Roosevelt's role in shepherding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to its adoption in the post-war era. There's the US negotiation of the International Covenants on Civil and Political Rights and Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, and the Convention Against Torture. The United States has been involved in these international efforts to make human rights a part of international life from the beginning of the modern post-war international law era. However, the United States has simply been reluctant to implement domestically what it has committed to internationally. So, for example, there's no cause of action that arises under the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which the United States ratified in 1992. There's no mechanism for the enforcement of international human rights in the United States, at least in our courts. The US participates in treaty bodies, which I think Jamil may mention a bit in his remarks, and occasionally the Supreme Court will allude to human rights, but it's never dispositive. So beyond this, the United States has largely opted out of the mechanisms by which human rights law is interpreted and enforced. It's not a party to individual complaints mechanisms of the treaty bodies, such as the Human Rights Committee of the ICCPR, or the CERD committee, that is the committee that monitors the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. It's not bound or party to the Inter-American Court on Human Rights. So we demand others to meet their obligations under international human rights law, even though we remain stubbornly outside the mainstream. We don't even speak human rights in some respects in our political and legal discourse. So I think those of us who are involved in this NHRI conversation think this is a loss because we lack mechanisms to develop human rights culture at the national level, and we lack the benefits that come from self-evaluation under human rights law. And so that leads to the second set of points that I want to highlight, which is the fact that a national human rights institution for the United States could be a part of the solution to that problem, to that hole in our human rights compliance. So let me say a few words about NHRIs. So 120 states, including most of our democratic peers, have an NHRI, a National Human Rights Institution, accredited by the Global Alliance on NHRIs. That is an association that essentially supports and in a light sense monitors NHRIs worldwide. They meaning NHRIs, come in all sorts of flavors according to what's appropriate for a given state. But at root, they are independent, state-sponsored or chartered bodies with legal mandates to protect and promote human rights domestically. And they're to be autonomous, independent, pluralist, resourced, and with the power at a minimum to investigate human rights issues domestically, that is, in their own countries. So there's a variety of models for NHRIs. There is absolutely no one-size-fits-all when it comes to NHRIs globally. And let me just highlight the four main models of NHRIs that exist around the world. There is first the commission model, which is a kind of quasi-judicial model. Sometimes it has a complaints mechanism associated with it, an enforcement power, sometimes the power to file amicus briefs before their courts, to conduct investigations, hearings, reporting. They are the most common sort of NHRI around the world, and they're also, in many respects, the most vigorous in the context of the scope of the work that they can do. So that's the NHRI as a commission. There's also the NHRI as an ombudsperson. So many states have an individual who is essentially mandated to monitor human rights in their country, typically, although not exclusively, monitoring human rights as conducted by their executive branch, or as implemented by their executive branch. And it tends to be a person with a small staff who has a voice at the national level to address human rights issues, and sometimes in a kind of flexible way to respond to human rights harms that might be existing in a particular country. A third model is a kind of advisory or consultative model. These are models that involve the non-handling. They don't handle complaints in the way that a commission or sometimes an ombudsperson might, but they're often a bridge between civil society and government. They counsel, they propose, sometimes they propose laws, sometimes policies. They advise government on actions that they can take to be in compliance with their human rights obligations. They often have expertise. They often have a very large number of individuals. In France, for example, its consultative commission is upwards of 60 individuals who serve a variety of functions, consulting and advising the French government. And then finally, there's the model of a research institute. Typically, a research institute may be the kind of model that would be available or most amenable in a situation where the state already has robust implementation through its domestic law of its human rights obligations. So, for example, Germany has a research institute model. And of course, human rights may be implemented and enforced. Causes of action may arise directly under German law and in German courts. So it provides that kind of mechanism which enables this institute to file amicus briefs, much like a commission might, or to address systemic issues through hearings and research, but it might not have the same kind of power as a commission might have. So those are the variety of models. And I realize I'm coming to the end of my allotted 10 minutes. So with that, Let me say one sort of concluding point about NHRIs, and then just a very short remark about what it is that we're hoping to accomplish. Generally speaking, it's true that all of the models for NHRIs face a variety of pressures within their own domestic systems. To say that a state has an NHRI is not to say that it is a state in a kind of human rights nirvana. Human rights and human rights law is always contested. And sometimes that contestation results in real stresses on NHRIs around the world. But oftentimes, these NHRIs provide real learning for states. They provide real mechanisms for human rights to be an aspect in which individual policymakers, civil society leaders, legislators, and others can really think through the issues in their country and think them through using the human rights lens. Now, finally, and I'll just conclude with this, what we're seeking is something from the Biden administration in particular, and something that we've asked for since last December, that is December of 2022, when a number of us, and in fact, nearly 100 individuals and organizations wrote a letter to the White House, in particular to Susan Rice as head of the the Domestic Policy Council, urging the administration to establish a kind of presidential commission to study the possibility of creating an NHRI for the United States. The ask is not simply that the United States create an NHRI tomorrow. There are many issues around the model that would be appropriate for the United States, the scope of an NHRI, the issues that it might address, the way it would develop its membership, and so forth, that should be a part of a serious conversation and a serious study that involves the White House, civil society, legislators, and others. And that's essentially our call for the moment. So I think maybe that's an appropriate place to stop, and then to turn it over to Jamil to speak more about that, and to speak more about many of these other issues and places where the NHRI issue has started to become a very real issue, both domestically and internationally. So thanks so much.
Thanks very much, David. Jamil, please.
Thank you again. Thank you, Dina. Thank you for the organizers, and thank you, David, for this very informative opening and covering pretty well everything that we have been trying to do and explaining the need for it. I want to start with maybe a couple of points that you've raised about the fact that the United States never created any domestic enforcement mechanisms and never really paid attention to or did take any effort to translate its international human rights commitments and legal obligations into domestic laws and policies. And that, I don't think that it was a sort of an accidental thing. I think it's by design. There was a notion of U.S. would sign on and ratify treaties, but we would not necessarily see them as important to translate them into legally binding domestically. It was, the idea was that we would join because it was a politically, geopolitically maybe important for the U.S. to show that they are joining the world in endorsing the principles and the values of human rights that we preach since the foundation of the United Nations and Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Well, we know that there was a consistent effort to undermine the applicability of human rights domestically. And I think it's not just about one side of it. It's not just like the Republicans, and it was more Republicans than Democrats, I think, share the blame for not doing enough or anything really to push this forward. And I think the reality now is that the US has become an outlier and become a country that is losing credibility and is losing the opportunity to benefit from these important human rights principles, values, treaties, and if you wish, culture of including everyone's rights, protecting everyone's rights, and providing for people more than what usually is included in the domestic system. So not only that we never really passed enabling legislation to effectuate our treaty obligations, we've rarely had any even oversight. You know, if you look at Congress, we only had one oversight, not even oversight, which was just a hearing that was done by a subcommittee in the Judiciary Committee in the Senate side in 2009 on U.S. implementation of human rights treaties. That's about it. So if you think about it, if we ever pass a law, or if you take seriously our legal obligations in the domestic system, it follows with implementation, follows with regulations, follows with policy, with guidance, with specifics, with resources, with mechanisms that could really implement, and particularly in the area of human rights or individual rights, it requires more than just aspirational or a good intention. And that was really been very lacking from the very beginning, whether it's couched in the US exceptionalism or in opposition to making human rights a reality in the US. And now I think we are in an era where there's a lot of support for this idea that it's not enough for the US to just show up at international reviews every 4 or 5 years, or now 8 years. There's a need to do some more concrete actions and measures domestically. What does that look like? Now, what we're talking about today is really about something that, as you said, as David mentioned, has been tried and implemented in over 120 countries. There's a mixed experiences. Some of those are very successful or less successful, but what's important is that they really have filled an important gap that exists in the United States, where there is no coordination whatsoever. There's no really monitoring of domestic human rights in the United States of any kind. What we focused on, of course, as a country is monitoring and enforcement of civil rights laws. And we have created some mechanisms for that, but they do not have the same mandate. They do not incorporate international human rights framework or mandate to monitor international human rights obligations. So the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, for example, doesn't have that mandate. And we will hear from Marta later on about also the state and local commissions. Some of them are called human rights commissions. What I would like to focus in my remarks is on the moment where we are right now, after almost 3 decades that the United States has appeared before human rights bodies, since the ratification of the ICCPR, the Civil and Political Rights Treaty in '92, and then since the ratification of 2 major treaties that were mentioned earlier, the Convention Against Torture and the Convention Against All Forms of Racial Discrimination in 1994. So we have about 30 years of experience that the U.S. have at least showed up and reported on progress made or could be made, or that to improve and to comply with our international human rights treaties. And on all of these reviews that happened over the last 3 decades, and particularly in the last 15 years, there has been a call for the United States to take further steps and concerted effort to implement its international human rights obligations. And we have seen the different human rights bodies that reviewed the United States calling for the U.S. to create a national human rights institution. It's kind of a request or a call that comes up not just for the U.S., but other countries that don't have NHRIs, and even for those that have NHRIs, they usually raise concerns or recommendations for improving and strengthen those NHRIs. For the U.S., it was a standing call or recommendation that you see it coming up in the last, as I said, 10, 15 years consistently. And the U.S. response has been, in general, we don't really need additional mechanism. We have some agencies and some mechanisms that exist within the U.S. Legal system that would be in charge of implementing our international human rights obligations. And they usually would refer to the fact that we have independent court system where people can bring lawsuits and legal actions to seek redress. They discuss other mechanisms that are available in the context of agencies like the EEOC around fighting employment discrimination, or in the context of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, et cetera, et cetera. So there's always been a general response that really we don't think that there's a need for that, for one that would specifically be focusing on human rights monitoring and implementation. And yet that was not satisfactory to the human rights body. So the last 2 years, since August 2022, we had the United States reviewed by the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And in that review, the call for NHRI was centered at the beginning of the review. And the U.S. government was aware of the fact that civil society has been calling for implementation mechanism. This is not the first time that civil society come together to call for that. We've had during the Obama administration, there was actually a campaign called Bringing Human Rights Home campaign that among other things called for some action on NHRI, and the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights and the Human Rights Institute at Columbia University, they issued a report, I think in 2012 or 11 or 12, that discussed specifically this idea of how maybe by reforming and expanding the mandate of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, this could be achieved within the United States. And yet we have seen no movement. Since the review of this CERD in August 2022, the U.S. has done really nothing to advance this idea. So what we did, and as you heard from David earlier, we have decided that we have to make more, much more than just doing it within the context of the U.S. reviews. We have garnered more support for the idea from domestic organizations representing different communities, different issue areas, from faith-based organizations to civil rights, traditional civil rights, racial justice, women's rights organizations, etc. And we have also engaged members of Congress because this is not an issue that obviously will be resolved by just the executive branch taking some action. In fact, for an NHRI to be fully independent and effective, it will require an enactment of legislation, adoption of legislation, and of course support through continuous funding, etc. However, we know that politically that's not going to be something that we'll be able to achieve, and therefore we focused on the demand for the White House to take action in the course of a presidential commission. In that regard, we have a congressional initiative and action by at least 9 members of Congress who last March signed a letter to the White House calling for the White House to create this presidential commission. And we've seen a growing number of organizations, networks, and communities and experts endorsing this idea. We have seen the U.S. government, again, before the UN Human Rights Committee in October, last October, being asked about this. And for the first time, we hear the committee saying to the US government, as a matter of priority, we would like you to prioritize the establishment of an NHRI. In fact, in the questioning, in the interactive dialogue with the committee member from South Korea raised the question of, or the idea or the initiative of presidential commission. The US government response was a little more open, as not completely dismissing the idea. They say that this is not something that they are willing to create, to do as an executive action to create this presidential commission, but they are open to continuing that dialogue. And in fact, we've had some recent contacts with the White House suggesting that they are continuing to be interested in seeing this idea come to fruition, if not during this administration, perhaps if there would be a second term Biden administration, they would be willing to take action on that. So I want to conclude to say that this is not, the goal is not just to do an NHRI. The goal is to really revive the needed debate around the need for human rights domestically, so that the US can really have more credibility when speaking and acting on human rights. By the way, the State Department has endorsed the idea of an NHRI in 2 statements to the Human Rights Council. When the Human Rights Council passed resolutions on NHRI, the State Department and the US government endorsed and supported those resolutions. So it's really a political capital or political will question. And the question is whether there is a political will to take that action and to give the chance for this idea exploration of the right model for the United States. I look forward to the questions, and I pass it on to my colleague and friend, Marta.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll just jump right in. Thanks as well to the organizers, and I'm really happy to have the opportunity to add to this conversation with my very experienced and smart colleagues, David and Jamil. So I've been asked to discuss ideas about implementation of a national human rights institution in the US. So I'll be getting down into the weeds a little bit more than we have up till now. As you can hear from the prior presentations, it's not that straightforward. And there's a lot of merit to the proposal that the US president set up a high-level commission to develop some specific proposals rather than jumping into setting up something that may not be adequately tailored to the US experience. There are some strong precedents to draw on for such a study commission, the proposal that's out there right now. You'll remember that pretty recently there was a bipartisan presidential study commission established by President Biden to develop a report on Supreme Court reform. And among other things, that looked at the issue of term limits for members of the Supreme Court and then the complex question of expanding the court. The study commission brought together 34 experts to examine issues and make recommendations. And at the end of the day, there was substantial agreement around the issue of term limits, if not the question of expanding the court. And so that it did move the ball to bring together this commission of experts. During President Obama's administration, he established a presidential study commission on bioethics issues. And then back in the 1950s, it was the President's Committee on Civil Rights, another study commission, that actually recommended creation of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. The commission itself was ultimately established by Congress in 1957 during the Eisenhower administration, following that study group's recommendation. So we've really got an exact precedent here of a study commission leading to the creation of a commission in the rights arena. Establishing an NHRI poses some additional complexity because we would all want an institution that conforms to international standards. The question isn't just what would work, from a domestic perspective, but what is consistent with international standards around NHRIs. And incorporating those standards would enable a U.S. national human rights institution to have a seat at the table during human rights treaty reviews and during other international review processes. And it would allow the U.S. NHRI to participate in collaborative efforts with other official NHRIs worldwide. Right now, we don't have any role in that and are not even part of those discussions. So we want something that's going to be consistent with the international standards so that we can join in to these international efforts. You heard a little bit about the principles of NHRIs called the Paris Principles. And these principles were endorsed by the United Nations more than 30 years ago to guide the establishment of national human rights institutions around the world. And they're rigorous substantive standards. David went over them very briefly. To meet those principles, it's important that any U.S. national human rights institution be sufficiently independent, have adequate funding and a broad mandate, have sufficient power and authority to meet its mandate, and that might mean power to investigate and subpoena, for example, and that it reflect pluralist values, that it not be captured by any particular political party or cultural faction or that kind of thing. Developing structures and creating practical frameworks that will reflect and actualize those principles is, to my mind, exactly the kind of thing that lawyers are particularly skilled at. So I think there is a special role for members of the American Bar Association to play in exploring the sorts of legal frameworks and structures that would yield an effective NHRI in the United States. There are some existing models within government already that can be used as inspiration. We've mentioned the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. That's perhaps the closest analog to an NHRI. It has a different mandate, as Jamil mentioned, but it is an independent agency working in the rights arena, and in the case of the Civil Rights Commission, charged with informing the development of national civil rights policy and enhancing enforcement of federal civil rights laws. Its commissioners are named through a combination of presidential appointments and congressional appointments with a split between political parties so that no one faction dominates. At times, that system has worked well. At other times, it's led to paralysis. Lack of adequate funding has also been an issue, with funding depending on congressional appropriations. So there are lessons that a Human Rights Study Commission could learn from these experiences in order to refine the NHRI structure. One important feature of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission's work is its state advisory committees. There's one in each state, district, and territory, and these serve as the local eyes and ears of the Civil Rights Commission. At times, these have been very effective in augmenting the Commission's work. A similar structure that included a local presence might be beneficial for an NHRI, extending its work to include local human rights issues that are close to home, where, as Eleanor Roosevelt famously reminded us, human rights begin. This sort of structure could also be an effective mechanism for engaging with the hundreds of human rights commissions in states and municipalities around the country, some of which already use international human rights norms as their lodestar. As other speakers have mentioned, the membership group, well, actually, you didn't mention it, but I'll mention it, that there's a membership group of international, local human rights agencies, the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, or IORA, and they have been very active in supporting the creation of a U.S. National Human Rights Institution Study Commission, and then also the NHRI itself. These state and local human rights advocates understand the value that would accrue from more opportunities for coordinating their work through a national human rights institution and for sharing strategies and resources at the national level. Another example that a study commission might draw on in developing a framework for US NHRI would be our nation's system of inspectors general. These are officials who monitor fraud and abuse by federal government agencies. Monitoring human rights implementation would be a key component of, or could be a key component of an NHRI, so that the auditing and inspection powers accorded to inspectors general might serve as a model. On the other hand, inspectors general are presidentially appointed, and sometimes that's resulted in politicization and has limited their independence. The Federal Communication Commission is another example of an independent federal agency that is statutorily bipartisan, but has nevertheless been drawn into political debates that rendered it less effective. However, its funding, which comes from regulatory fees, has been more stable, and that might be a model for consideration in thinking about the funding of and the independence of a national human rights institution. A study commission might also examine the civil rights offices attached to federal agencies, such as the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services or the U.S. Department of Education. While not fully independent, so they fall short of the Paris Principles standards, these agencies have mechanisms for the filing of individual complaints and drafting of regulatory guidance that might be useful examples for an NHRI. So, like all of these existing models, there are lessons to be learned as we think about framing a national human rights institution in the United States. But the bottom line is that there is nothing quite like an NHRI currently in the United States. There are, of course, hundreds of international models, or at least 120 plus, that we can draw on. So, for example, while most of our peer nations have national human rights commissions, and David went over the different types of entities that there are, a few, like Austria, have human rights ombudsmen, and properly structured ombudsman programs can meet the rigorous standards of the Paris Principles as well. Another international example that we might consider is Canada, which has a Canadian Human Rights Commission that works in close collaboration with provincial level human rights commissions to ensure that the local impact of human rights implementation. In sum, there are many nuances and challenges involved in implementing a U.S. national human rights institution, But we also know that most countries in the world, many countries in the world, and most of our peers certainly have already developed national human rights institutions, and many have long track records of effective work. Given the wealth of information available and the international community's great interest in supporting this effort, a presidential NHRI study commission would have a great deal of information to draw on and an opportunity to draw on these existing models within our system and outside to creatively explore and develop proposals for an NHRI tailored to the unique needs of the U.S. human rights context. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dina and look forward to discussing the questions that people have put into the forum here. Thanks.
Thank you all. This is very rich, and given how much work has been done and how much you described, it almost seems counterintuitive that, as you say, there's nothing quite like this that exists in the U.S. because it seems like there's so much to build on and there's so much already going on. But this was really, really helpful. And there are a lot of questions. I think I'll start. There's a couple of questions that are sort of nuts and bolts kinds of structural questions. So let's start maybe with those. One is sort of how do you how do you go about selling the human rights idea, the NHR idea model in this U.S.? What are prerequisite conditions that might need to happen, political will? And another even more nuts and bolts question is how would commissioners or ombudspeople be appointed or selected? How is that done in other countries? You've described this a little bit just now, Martha, but the question that this person asked is also kind of about getting buy-in by the population for a membership in the institution beyond the institution itself. I think any one of you should feel free to answer the question. They're not really directed.
Well, I guess I'll kick it off because and Martha and Jamil might have more to say as well. I think this question about membership selection is really an excellent one because, Dina, as you suggested, it's a nuts and bolts kind of question, but it is also about a core principle of NHRIs and, as the question itself suggests, about building support for an NHRI. I mean, I think fundamentally, if an NHRI is seen as a tool of a particular faction or party, it's unlikely to succeed and, frankly, unlikely to meet the principles of pluralism and autonomy and independence that are required under the Paris Principles. So, states do this in all sorts of ways. How this meaning they appoint members or ombudspersons in all sorts of ways. I mean, and we could even imagine from our own process of nomination and confirmation, there being a kind of process by which individual members are selected that, sort of ensure that multiple voices across a political spectrum are able to play a part in that membership selection and have the requisite buy-in thereafter. You can also imagine, having, there's some American institutions that require a certain number from one political party and a certain number from the same number from another political party, and then maybe a few independents. I mean, there's a variety of ways to do this. And this would be one of the, I think, core discussions that a commission to study an NHRI would need to evaluate. But it's a great question, and there's as many states as there's that kind of variety. I mean, I think the point of buy-in and building support is a part of this. It's part of the reason why I think we're proposing a commission process to build a conversation around NHRIs. But at the end of the day, it's true, you need to have political will. You need to, and that's, I think, one of our obligations is to really convince people that an NHRI in the United States is not only one of our obligations, right, to implement our human rights obligations, but it is also something that can really add value to the way in which Americans enjoy their rights, build responsible institutions, and so forth.
I agree with David, pretty much everything he said. I would just add a couple of things. I mean, it would be definitely an uphill battle. I don't think anyone has an illusion that it's going to be easily achieved. I think the point of starting this conversation and discussion is to have a debate even about human rights in the United States. I think the discussion, or there's no debate, or if there is one, there's a very distorted one that is not rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and those universal human rights values and principles. And there's always been running away from it, shying away from it, or at least the ones, either in the political actors or in the legal community, there are not, there's lack of courage and boldness in bringing and talking about what is that going to look like, and why this really needed and matters. I want to mention in 1998, the Clinton administration issued an executive order, 13107, on implementation of human rights treaties. And it came right after the ratification of the 3 principal treaties that were mentioned earlier. Now, that was not an easy step, meaning it was naturally a right step to do, because once you have ratified treaties, laws were not passed because we had made reservations, understanding declarations that limited the applicability of those treaties. So the executive branch took that initiative, and that was an important initiative. But what you see after that EO was issued is that there were immediately ideological opposition attacking the White House and the Clinton administration for doing something that was very basic in terms of we ratify treaties. This is part of our constitutional system and part of the supremacy clause of what the treaties mean when they are ratified by the Senate, or at least providing the Senate advice and consent. And as an executive branch, as responsible, serious, and commitment to implementing such a treaty, the executive branch took this action. And so I think we would likely, and I think the experience of that reaction to that EO, and I got some FOIA documents about what the White House received after the EO was issued, which suggests that there is some sort of a fear that this could be the same reaction of any initiative of such magnitude would be resulting in a backlash or an attack on the ideological basis, right? And I think that it needs to be addressed, meaning that yes, we are living in a different era. There's a more polarization politically, and there's nothing really on a bipartisanship is not something that people are accustomed to right now in DC. But I think doesn't mean that we should not try to get this idea, at least foster the principles and the values and the culture of human rights. And I think what we are trying to sell here is not NHRI to be established right now, an appointment of commissioners, but we are trying to say to the administration, the minimum that you can do is to explore the idea, put together a series of experts and a committee of experts that would be able to hear from different people, different organizations, different academic institutions, and different people, including people from outside the US that can benefit from that conversation. And let's see what is the right model for it. What is the right steps that we need to take next, whether by Congress or by the executive branch. So I think that politically it shouldn't be, again, a difficult thing to sell for the idea of presidential commission. It's that I think it seems that it's it's kind of abstract. It's not connected to the issues, but I think they are very much that these institutions can help foster better understanding for the rights of everyone, addressing some of the issues that we don't necessarily have a venue for, short of going to court or some of the other avenues that are close to most people and communities. And so I think that there is a need for expanding the support for the idea, and that's what we are doing. The ACLU with SPLC and many other organizations are a part of a campaign now for a US NHRI. And part of it is to try to bring different voices, different constituencies to agree that this is something worthwhile investing in, worthwhile discussing, rather than dismissing it as, oh, it will never be functional, will not be effective. And so I think that there is so much to learn from the experiences, as Marta mentioned, around implementation and the work of the US Commission on Civil Rights and other institutions. But I think that we also have an opportunity today to be able to offer something that we've never been tried before, really. And to connect it to the need for addressing some fundamental issues, and particularly when the U.S. is not likely to ratify any new human rights treaties anytime soon. So what we are left with right now is just these periodic reviews that are happening. There's not much implementation, follow-up. Again, this could create the momentum. This could create this place for creating the space for people to come together to address the need and for to hear different perspectives and to hopefully move it in the right direction.
So I'll just add, if that's okay. I know we're still working on the first question. In terms of the well, let me just mention first that, of course, we know that in decades in the past, human rights wasn't a partisan issue. You know, that Nixon was a champion of the Women's Rights Convention, and maybe there'll be a time that we can go back to that and see it as something that is really a common issue and not something that's partisan. We've talked about the impact of a national human rights institution and of expansion of access to human rights, with the impact it might have domestically. I just want to say a word about its international impact. The fact that we don't have a national human rights institution means that we're not at the table for some of these discussions, and it affects us diplomatically as a nation, in that we are not part of GANRI, are not part of these collaborative efforts, did not have a national human rights institution that speaks up at treaty body hearings and so on. And so I think there's a way in which it suppresses our standing internationally as well, which is maybe not the first pitch in order to get people mobilized around the issue, but is an aspect of the the consequences that we face because we don't have one.
Thanks. Yeah, we're still on the first question, which is great because there's a lot of information there. I think what I'm going to do now is frame two different questions. There are a number of questions that some of the panelists have been answering in the Q&A, but I'm going to bring some of them up anyway because people aren't all reading the answers. And this way also to get a couple of questions out at once so we can move on from there. The two questions here have to do with political will. One of them is about political will, and you all have touched on some of this already, but specifically, question is, could you discuss any difficulties in advocating for a US NHRI, considering the Supreme Court's reluctance to discuss or consider international or human rights law? Related to that, I think, not about SCOTUS, but how would an NHRI be free from political influence? Wouldn't this just become partisan, divided along party lines, like so many other institutions that we have? Don't we need a common understanding in this country of what human rights are? So there's a little pessimism there. The other question, different question, is to talk about, and again, you've already brought some of this up, but could you talk about potential issues that an NHRI would deal with in this country? For example, constitutional guarantees largely don't apply. I'm reading from what someone's written, to private conduct, but are usually, or at least prominently, related to government acts. Would an NHRI model be effective here within such limitations and the notions of personal freedom that we have? And somebody else wants to know about whether an NHRI could address racialized profiling in police practices, access to abortion care, environmental harms, treatment of prisoners in U.S. prisons and jails. There are other examples, but you folks can go off on yours. I put myself in a link. Do you want to start, Martha, since you, or you don't have to?
Sure, no, it's all right. It looked like David was about to speak. Am I right? No. So, I mean, I guess this does touch on the issues that we already talked about, the way in which we hope and think that a presidential commission would begin to educate people about what the benefits of a national human rights institution might be, and would stimulate the conversation, the national conversation around this, in the same way that the other presidential commissions that I mentioned did that. I think, human rights is a very broad topic. And so one of the issues that the questioners raised was, is this national human rights body going to be addressing every possible aspect of what comes up under treaty bodies? And David probably can speak more to this, but I know that one example of a human rights commission that was set up fairly recently is Sweden, and they have begun their work by doing a sort of listening sessions around the country to try to figure out what their priorities could be, recognizing that it's not possible for a single body to address every aspect of human rights. Having said that, I mean, I mentioned a couple of times the possibility of connecting a national body with local and municipal or state and municipal bodies. And that definitely expands the reach and allows for prioritization of human rights issues that are being faced maybe in one region or one locality that aren't of national scope. And so there are opportunities there to engage with a very broad range of issues, even if they're done at different levels of government rather than just at the national human rights institution level. So I think that we're proposing a study commission in order to address some of these issues, but I think it's clear that there may, it's not that we don't think there could be solutions, or could be mechanisms that would be productive and workable in this area.
I just want to add another thing, is that NHRI is not going to be providing solutions to all the problems that we have in the country. I mean, including the not only just the political, but also the judicial issues that we've seen, like where the judiciary, a federal bench, or I think that it offers maybe a certain aspect that we have neglected, which would be in of itself a huge achievement, just on the level of creating more education and visibility and learning around human rights. So some commissions and NHRIs are more modest in what they try to achieve. They're not trying to go and solve all the problems and hear all the complaints and investigate and do. They're trying to really prioritize, and I think Martha's point is really important, is that it really has to be rooted and we have to be complementary to other existing mechanisms and avenues of redress or other political recourse for communities that they have. And the NHRI would be able to do an over kind of a focus on certain areas where the US is lagging behind, where there is not enough attention, and that's could be part of the role that NHRI in the US. For example, in the US, the social economic rights are not something that receive much attention, particularly from the political and judicial branches, because of the way that social economic rights are not protected, particularly under our federal constitution. And yet, an NHRI that is following universal principles of human rights would have to address social economic rights in a way that would help address some of the historical problems that we have in the United States. It would have to also address issues of race and class and gender that are really core of on many of the problems that we see nowadays. So while I think we have to think about it as incremental progress, as baby steps that we can take in order to address and to foster the understanding and the culture of human rights in the United States, rather than seeing an NHRI and raising so much expectations, and then people will say, well, we warned you that yeah, that's not what we're aiming for. We're aiming for additional avenue for discussing. I mean, why is it possible for the Trump administration to create under Pompeo a commission that was created in order to oppose universal human rights? And that was something that was given the resources of the government, that has been against everything that the United States has signed on and ratified and said for decades. And yet it would be something that's not imaginable, just to have some commission to say, look, we have made commitments and obligations, and it's the time to take them seriously and to think really about ways to realize those and to make them a reality here in the United States. I mean, again, that's not a big ask. And the human rights are not devoid from politics and political real. It's part of the struggle, and as long as we see it that way, we have to be able to achieve those things by understanding the political forces that are against human rights. I don't think that it makes sense to just avoid this conversation. I think we people who are interested in this project will have to be committed to universal human rights, and that means rights for all, equality for all, and that's that. And if that's going to be no exceptions, right? And so that's going to be an issue that we have made those compromises in the U.S. political system, that I think this idea of human rights, if taken seriously, will have to address them head on. And I think that's, yes, part of the challenge, but at the same time, that's part of the opportunity here.
Maybe I can just add sort of one I think barrier or hurdle that we often have in a substantive way, and then maybe one example just to give a flavor of what an NHRI could do. I mean, hypothetically and in the abstract. So, one argument that I think many of us often hear is, well, why would we need to do this? I mean, the United States has a constitution that guarantees equality, guarantees freedom of expression, guarantees religious freedom, guarantees all of these different things that are also guaranteed by human rights law. So why do we need to do this? We already have our constitution, we have our courts. And that's a fair comment. But I think that there's at least two responses to that. One is, well, if anybody's been sentient over the last 5 or 6 years, particularly maybe over the last year, you might think, well, does the Constitution, at least as our courts are interpreting it, actually provide the kind of protection that human rights requires? So there's that, and that is an issue, I think, for people to take into account. The other is that not all issues are handled, even human rights issues are handled through legal mechanisms. And so an NHRI can be a way to surface problems that might not have a legal or a kind of cause of action solution, but they might have a kind of, if you think about human rights, not only in the negative sense, but in the positive obligation of the state to create the environment for the enjoyment of human rights, well, maybe an NHRI can help create sort of an open way of thinking about a rights-respecting culture that isn't only about, courtrooms and litigation. And so to give an example of that, I think, we might think about the rise of artificial intelligence and the particular use of algorithmic technologies in the context of law enforcement or social welfare benefits, where we've seen, I mean, there's quite a bit of reporting on this, quite a bit of bias that's built into those systems, whether it's profiling in either law enforcement or welfare benefits contexts, or denials that are algorithmically driven and so forth. One can imagine that there may not be, in those situations, a cause of action that arises, even though it's an obvious problem. And an NHRI could be a place where you have hearings, you can explore how other states that are also rights respecting are handling these kinds of issues, we could sort of understand what does a human rights angle add to our own kind of legal conversation or policy conversation in the United States about how to solve those problems. You could imagine an NHRI then reporting on the topic, maybe proposing model legislation. There's all sorts of ways in which we could imagine that particular issue being handled within the context of an NHRI. And you could imagine other similar kinds of issues as well.
I'll just thank you, David and Jamil. I'll just add one other sort of angle on the NHRI is that it's also, about government accountability to fulfill government's obligations under human rights commitments that we've made. And just an example, we have, along with other countries around the world, endorsed the Sustainable Development Goals, but almost all of our peers have prepared voluntary national reviews that set sort of benchmarks and standards for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The U.S. has not done that, and it's partly because there's not any group in the U.S. that has responsibility for doing it. And a national human rights institution would be a place where maybe the NHRI wouldn't do this itself, but would make sure that there was some accountability within government to fulfill the obligations that we've taken on publicly in those kinds of domains. Another example is the expectation that all countries are going to be developing national action plans on business and human rights. The U.S. hasn't done that, and it's partly because there isn't any place in government that's responsible for doing it.
Thanks. That was a very rich set of responses and a lot of information there. There's a set of questions that I think are far more simple. Among the so-called Western nations, developed nations, which other countries lack an NHRI? And what kind of movement do you know about in those settings? And then to what extent has the US actually been criticized by the UN or other parts of the international community for the lack of an NHRI? How forceful has that criticism been?
I'm happy to take this one on the, at least in the context of European countries or the OSCE, the countries that are part of the OSCE, Organization of Security and Cooperation of Europe, because it covers also Canada and the US with other countries in Europe. The US is with Italy and I think the Czech Republic are the only countries that have not created an NHRI. Switzerland, and as you heard, Sweden most recently created one. So they're really almost a majority, overwhelming majority of states, at least in the European context, where Western democracies, where their democracies are vibrant and working. I mean, we're not talking about countries that failed states or states that are under authoritarianism, because obviously in those states, NHRI, just like other institutions, will be collapsing as well, lacking credibility. Although in some states, by the way, where there was a notions of greater authoritarianism and abandoning, democracy or democratic principles, some NHRIs have been one of the last pockets of resistance, so to speak, in terms of pushing back against that sort of. But for that matter, the U.S. is really standing with very few countries, particularly in the Western democracies, that don't have an NHRI. And the criticism internationally has been really raised in many of the U.S. involvement, engagement with international human rights bodies. I mean, most recently, even the UN independent expert mechanism on racial justice and equality in law enforcement that was created after the murder of George Floyd to monitor the excessive use of force or deadly force and systemic racism and discrimination, particularly against people of African descent. So after visiting the US in May of last year, concluded in its report that the US should also create an NHRI. The US, as we heard from the treaty bodies that reviewed the US in the last couple of years, special rapporteurs that engage the US have also made that call. We've seen other countries, raising this in their UPR, when the Universal Periodic Review every 5 years, the US is subject to, some countries raise that call or recommendation for the US. I think there's certainly an important role for the international community to sound, to raise this and ask the US to follow through on on commitments and obligations, particularly domestically, and we're likely to hear more of that. But I think ultimately it has to come from the national level, from domestic movement, and that's why we're really hoping that this idea will gain more roots and more support in different parts of the country, leading to not only the White House but also other political actors, particularly in Congress, to see the importance of moving this idea forward.
There was another question that was just put in the Q&A that relates to this, Jamil. Are there specific examples, NHRIs, that you all think have been most effective and would be useful to recommend modeling for the US?
In my view, I think it'd be good to look at the examples of states that have a federal system where there is provinces like in Canada, the Canadian model, or the Australian model as well. Germany has also a federal system, as some of you know. Mexico, by the way, has an interesting model, although they had some, and the National Mexican Human Rights Commission has also been very interesting involvement. So there are so many models. I would think that those are the countries that offer the most interesting models for the US because of their size and their political structure, and how the complementarity works within the national NHRI and this more provincial or the local state commissions. And that's what we're hoping, that they're, again, building on the important work of state and local human rights commissions, that they have such an important role to play, that NHRI will not take their role, but rather complement and strengthen their role, provide guidance, provide support, engage with them, and sometimes even do things in collaboration. There's, by the way, a model at the US Commission on Civil Rights. There are advisory committees all over the country. They're underused, in my view. They are not given enough support and visibility and resources. Marta served on the one in Massachusetts, so maybe you're still on it. I serve on the one in New York, and we're just completing a study on the US on the child welfare system in New York State. The similar models exist that I think could be really fostered and enhanced to provide sort of and learn from other experiences. But ultimately, it is a political question, of a political capital question, a political will question, and which would ultimately, how many people are asking this to be part of what our government should do, right? And that's what campaigns are about, and that's what we're hoping to do in the next few months and years.
Thank you, Jamil. David, go ahead, and then we're just about out of time, so I wanted to wrap things.
Oh, super quickly, just to sort of piggyback onto Jamil's point. One of the things that we've seen, and there was also a question about this, we've seen over the last several years, last couple of decades, a real rise in interest and institutionalization of human rights at the local levels, right, at municipal and state levels. And there, we're talking about a national human rights institution, but there's also room for other models. There's also room for states to do this, and ultimately for there to be state models that perhaps connect eventually to a national model. I mean, this could be a very open process that really enables people across the country to engage in human rights. And I think that I imagine that all of us on this panel would agree that that's the goal. I mean, the goal is really creating human rights institutions and a human rights culture across the United States.
David, thank you. I'm going to pose the last question to you, Marthas, to give you a chance to speak, because it's basically about implementation. It's about what can we do. And I want to mention that a couple of people have identified themselves as being representing state human rights commissions or local human rights commissions, which is wonderful. And some questions have been is there a sign-on letter? How can our organization support the efforts in within the Biden administration? I think let me tag on to that, the question about the ABA's role. What would be, what would be the most effective initiative that the ABA could mount? I mean, we could do a resolution, hopefully, but that would just be a small thing. We want to have some action items to go with that. So, Martha.
Yeah, thanks. I haven't seen the questions that you mentioned. I didn't have a chance to check, but I hope that people that are involved in state and local human rights commissions would be engaged with the International Association of Official Human Rights Agencies, which has had programs on this at their annual meeting, is signing on to letters, is participating in the coalition that's working on this. And so that's a real way for state and local commissions to get involved in the NHRI movement. There are also things, of course, that people could do locally, and David mentioned that. I know that the Provincial Human Rights Commission of Ontario has itself adopted the Paris Principles and aspires to incorporate them. And so it's certainly possible for a state or local human rights agency to say, we're going to use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as our kind of aspirational goal, and then implement programs that we think further a human rights agenda. Of course, there's also a human rights cities movement in the US that is engaging in this way. So I think all of those things are useful, and IORA is one place to kind of plug into some of that local and state level initiatives. And then the second question you asked was, the ABA. So I think, as I mentioned, I think folks in the legal community have particular expertise on structuring institutions in these ways. I can imagine not only a resolution, but some kind of committee report about options. If we're not successful in getting in the near term a presidential commission, there's certainly room for other experts to come together to develop that expertise and put those ideas out there as a way to continue the dialogue. So I can certainly imagine that, as well as the ABA being more directly involved in efforts to pressure the administration.
Well, thank you, all three of you. Thank you all. There's still over 100 people on the call. I want to thank you all for joining us today. We really, the ABA, the section on civil rights and social justice, the international law section, really want to express our gratitude to you three, Jamil, Martha, and David, for sharing your knowledge, for the incredible advocacy work that you've been doing and continue to do, and will continue to do. And you can be sure that you will be tagged, to help out with the ABA in the future. And speaking of critical work, I want to once again thank Hadar Harris, who's been throwing fabulous links into the chat, and also to thank ABA staff Ali Kielsgaard and Luke Graves for making this program and so many others happen so smoothly. As most of you know, the section of Civil Rights and Social Justice provides free webinars and resources for legal professionals and advocates nationwide, and hopes that this helps you in your work. And please consider joining the ABA if you're not already a member. You can do that at CRSJ, Civil Rights and Social Justice. Best of luck to everyone. Thank you, Jamil, Martha, and David, and stay safe. Thank you so much. Last but not least, this has been taped and it will be made available to